But now I'd like to introduce our speaker. So Professor Michael Hornberger is originally from Germany, and he studied at University College London. He's held positions at the University of Cambridge and also the University of Sydney in Australia. He joined UEA in 2015 and is now the head of the Department of Medicine, and he's a Professor of Applied Dementia Research at our Norwich Medical School. He's also the Director of Ageing Research in the Norfolk and Suffolk Mental Health Trust. His research focuses on improving diagnosis, disease progression tracking, and symptom management in dementia. His research group uses a variety of approaches, examining the condition through clinical presentation, cognition, neuroimaging, and genetics. They're also exploring a number of innovative disease interventions as part of their research studies. Michael works in close collaboration with a range of partners and colleagues from a range of disciplines. That includes old age psychiatrists, neurologists, nurses, clinical psychologists, and speech and language therapists. Together, they approach the problem of dementia from a multidisciplinary angle. In his talk tonight, Michael will take us through the risk factors for dementia, as well as the cutting-edge research his group are undertaking into prevention, diagnosis, and potential treatments for the condition. Finally, he will talk about what can be done to reduce your risk of developing dementia. So it makes me very proud, actually, that I can introduce Michael this evening, and that we have colleagues like him and his team working on these very important societal challenges, health challenges. And I'm also pleased to report that both UEA and the UEA Students' Union have committed to joining the Norwich City Dementia Action Alliance. This means our staff and students are helping to raise awareness of dementia and research into the condition, as well as making Norwich a more inclusive city for people and their families living with dementia. So I'd like you now to please join me in welcoming Michael to give tonight's London Lecture.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. What an honor to talk to you tonight about our research in dementia in general. I'm very excited to be here. I hope you can all hear me and the microphone is working. In the back rows, can you all hear me well? Fantastic, excellent. So as Fiona very kindly and showcased already what I'm going to talk about, I will really talk through dementia in general, give you a bit of a background on dementia. Why is it a challenge for our society? And then I will talk about our research we're conducting. I will really only showcase very few studies because there are many studies, as you can imagine, ongoing. And it's really more important that I give you a few glimpses on what we're doing. And maybe at future occasions, you can come to one of our other lectures and find out more in detail which other projects we're running. So dementia, well, if you talk about dementia, you talk about aging, of course. And really, the reason for this is these are the government projections for additional people in the population pyramid. So you can see ages 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and so on until 100. What we had at 2008 and what the addition will be by 2033. And what you can really see is that the aging population will increase significantly in the UK. And the government is aware of this, and there's lots of provisions for this. Now, with aging, however, you will also have dementia. And these are the rates of dementia by age group for male, female, and both. And what you can see, dementia is quite rare in younger people, but it occurs, and that's very often under-recognized, but increases quite a lot the older you become. So from 55 up to over 95, these are the rates of dementia. So the older you get, your risk of dementia is getting higher, and therefore age is the biggest risk factor for developing dementia. Now, therefore, aging is really important for dementia, and for our society, which is aging, we will have more dementia around. Now, what's really the background for dementia? How many people are there with dementia at the moment in the UK? There are, at the moment, around 850,000 people living with dementia in the UK. And these numbers are predicted to rise by 35% to 2025 and 146% by 2050. And it's exactly what I just talked about. It's really the increasing aging population. You will have more dementia. And it just gives you in a graph, basically. You have, again, for male and females and for both, you can see that numbers are projected to double, if not triple, over the next 30 years. And this, of course, poses an enormous challenge for our society and the NHS in particular, who will see a lot of these cases, that we will see increasing numbers of dementia patients coming. Now, how does dementia then compare to other major diseases which are at the moment out there? And again, you can see with the aging population that dementia actually has a big impact on this. So you will have here, and I'm sorry if you can't read this, but in orange, these are ischemic heart diseases. So this is your classic heart attack, heart failures. And you can see the government's programs to improve health really has reduced this a lot. And of course, the treatments are very, very good. Now, in contrast, dementia, you can see it's exactly the opposite is happening. And last year, for the first time, the number of deaths by dementia has overtaken any of the other major conditions. So, for example, cerebral vascular diseases are strokes, which you can see are very well managed. Sorry, this is the strokes. But dementia is still currently rising and will overtake this. And as I just told you, it will double, if not triple. So it will overtake all the major diseases. Now, the cost to the society is enormous at the moment already. So this is at the moment £26 billion per year dementia costs the UK economy. And most of this is actually carried by private carers who can't work actually more because most dementia patients are cared for at home. And it has higher health and social care costs than cancer, stroke, and chronic heart disease combined. So you can imagine for health services, social services, the NHS, it's very scary that we will have double the amount of people in the future, and already the costs are more than all these other major diseases combined. So it's a real challenge for our society. Therefore, the costs are meant to double in the next 25 years to up to £55 billion in 2040. Now, the irony with this is that this is the amount of money the government and charities give to research to different diseases. Here you can see cancer. These are the cardiovascular and heart disease. This is dementia and this is stroke. And you can see the gap is enormous. And of course, there has been a huge focus on cancer over the last 20 to 30 years. We've seen enormous advancements, and part of it is due because of the large funding from the government and charities towards this. But for dementia, research money is still comparatively very, very low. This is changing currently, and we're very excited about this, that the government has really woken up to this. David Cameron in particular was very keen before he went out, and now we're trying, of course, to convince Theresa May that this is a societal challenge we need to take up as well. Any Prime Minister who will be over the next 30 years in government will have to deal with this. And the ratio of dementia research to cancer research is at the moment 1:4. This is the other thing, we're trying to excite people. So getting the young students excited about dementia, which can be a challenge, because cancer, people are very excited about it. They think about genetics, molecular work, very exciting. Well, dementia, people think, old people disease. It's much, much harder for actually exciting students for this. So having a platform for this is really important for us. Now, we at UEA have created a dementia research collaborative to really reach out much more to the general public and to the students. And this is a bi-monthly forum where we invite people and we give presentations, we take turns. This was just happened last week. And it's basically, these are the lead people, so who lead the groups, the main research groups. So this is not all the people in UEA. Behind them, there are many, the big groups who do dementia research at UEA. And of course, I want to invite you all to our next event on the 14th of June. And there will be also, I think it's also advertised in the program, and you can find out information from the websites, of course. So if you are in Norwich, please come to this. We'll be excited to have you. So I've talked about dementia, but I haven't actually told you yet what is dementia. And this is one of the most common questions, in a way, I get at public talks. And it's a tricky one to answer, because dementia itself is not a disease. And this comes as a surprise to many people. Dementia is really just a collection of symptoms under which several diseases are categorized. So dementia is really an umbrella term under which these 4 major types of dementias are classified. And I've ordered them by prevalence. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, followed by vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies. There are other dementias then, which are less common. Now, because Alzheimer's disease is the most common one, people assume dementia means Alzheimer's disease. And it's one of the most common questions, well, what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? Well, Alzheimer's disease is only one form of dementia. Now, this is the pretty picture. Now I'm giving you the depressing picture, because from the scientific perspective, this is very nice to look at and very easily classified. This is the real picture at the moment we're looking in terms of dementia. And that's for our patients extremely frustrating, for us researchers extremely exciting, because it is a very, very complex disease. We have different clinical presentations, different proteins which go wrong in the brain, different pathology and different genes which are all interacting and overlapping between clinical syndromes. Very, very complex, very difficult if a patient presents in the clinic to decide what type of dementia they have, which of course will determine their treatment. It's a really important point to make. So let's go back to the safety of our umbrella, because we don't want to have the complexity of this. What I'm going to do, I'm just talking you through these 4 major ones, so you get a glimpse how they're presenting, because most of you will be familiar with Alzheimer's disease, but you might not have heard of the other diseases. So Alzheimer's disease, well, we need a grumpy-looking German neurologist called Alois Alzheimer, and he was the first person really describing Alzheimer's disease. And he made a report of this, which was little recognized for a while. Now, the fantastic thing is we have, and it's very rare for diseases which were described at the end of the 19th century, we have also a picture of his first patient. And this is August Dieter, who was the first Alzheimer's disease patient. And I like to show this. It really just shows you the face behind the disease in a way. It's really fantastic to have that. And you have even the original transcript of his first clinical interview with her, which I partly translated for you from the old German, which I'm not sure you will be otherwise struggling. But he basically said to her, "Where do you live? Oh, you have been to our place. Are you married? Oh, I'm so confused. Where are you right now? Here and everywhere, here and now. You must not think badly of me." It's a very kind of moderate dementia, we would say, somebody very confused. And she was in a mental asylum at the time, because those were where most dementia patients ended up at this stage. Now, the critical connection, though, that Alzheimer's made, he didn't describe only her case. After she died, he made an autopsy on her brain and found very specific changes in the brain, particularly in one region called the hippocampus, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. And these are his original drawings of cells in the brain, which basically, in her brain, which he assumed were responsible for the symptoms. And this is the importance. He made the relationship between a disease in the brain with the symptoms, and was the first sign that dementia is not healthy aging, it's a disease in the brain happening. Now, these original drawings we see today through the microscope, and they're called amyloid plaque and tau tangles. So these are proteins in the brain, and they start in one region and basically spread over time across the whole brain. And hence we have a progression with dementia, and people get worse and worse and worse over time. So as I said, it's the most common form of dementia. Around 70% of patients have Alzheimer's disease. Hence people think dementia means Alzheimer's disease. People usually present with memory problems or getting lost. They ask the same question over and over and drive their families mad, basically, because they can't remember the information, or asking for directions. So we had patients, for example, getting into strangers' cars and say, "Can you drive me home?" because they were lost in the street. Majority of people will be 65 over, however, up to 25% can be younger than 65. And this is we do a lot of research in younger onset dementia below 65. Youngest dementia patients I've ever seen was 29. So it is not a disease only of old age. It's extremely rare at younger age, but it occurs. Genetic cases are very rare. less than 1%, and this is the other most common question. My grandfather had dementia. What does that mean for my risk for dementia? Usually it's very low that you will have the risk of developing this because the genetic cases are very, very rare. You need to have a lot of family members who need to be affected to have a genetic risk. What happens really in the brain is that these proteins accumulate, and which basically causes the nerve cells to die. And then the nerve cells shrink. Why this happens, we don't know. And why this progresses through the brain, we don't know either. There's a Nobel Prize to be won out there. So that's what I always tell the students. There is some excitement here to happen. You should really do some research in this direction. And then we have different disease stages. Now the next one is vascular dementia. And it's the second most common form of dementia, around quite another percentage of people. And it's more distinguished by having a stepwise deteriorating course. So people maintain the same levels of a function for some time. And it's more caused by cerebral vascular disease. So if your heart, for example, is not well, or you have a thrombus, so a clot in the heart, and it goes up to the brain, it causes, of course, a stroke. And vascular dementia is nothing else than mini strokes. They have usually more problems presenting with information processing, so they get really confused between information, but the memory is usually more intact. Ooh. So it's more due to cardiovascular risk factors. So if you have hypertension, diabetes, atherosclerosis, bad diet, you smoke a lot, you drink a lot of alcohol, you will have a higher risk for vascular dementia. And of course, if you talk about hypertension, well, older people in general have a lot of hypertension and have a lot of diabetes. So that explains again why dementia might be so prevalent. So how does vascular dementia happen? Well, the cardiovascular changes, they cause really these microbleeds in the brain. So these are tiny, tiny strokes. They're not like big strokes, which we assume, which we see in stroke people where people, for example, lose the motoric function of a limb. They're really tiny strokes, which are really, on the outside, nothing really happens. You don't notice very much. But they can really lead to dementia because the proteins are affected by these mini strokes. And so many older people have these changes in the brain. So if someone has Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular brain infarcts, then it's diagnosed as mixed dementia, which it can be very often as well. Right, let's just go quickly through the other two, which are much less common. Frontotemporal dementia, another grumpy-looking German neurologist called Arnold Pick, but he was not as lucky to keep the name for the disease, so it's now called frontotemporal dementia because the Swedish people renamed it in the 1980s. But basically, these patients have a lot of changes to the front of the brain and the temporal side of the brain. And this is just an imaging, and there are 3 different types. And what this causes, it causes severe behavioral changes to these patients. So they present with very severe behavioral personality changes and language problems as well. Finally, dementia with Lewy bodies, very rare form of dementia. They show really thinking problems, but also behavioral movement and autonomic changes. So for example, they can't sweat anymore. These are common autonomic changes. And the symptoms can fluctuate very largely, and sudden improvements and sudden deteriorations. And they have very often vivid hallucinations, which is described here. So really extremely vivid hallucination is one of the presenting symptoms. And the movement problems they have is very similar to Parkinson's disease. There is a strong overlap with Parkinson's disease, which of course is another very strong age-related disease. Right. So now you're all experts in dementia. You can go out, diagnose anybody who comes along, hopefully not. But how would we diagnose in general people? And I'm not going to talk about all these different dementias. I will really focus on Alzheimer's disease and our research in this direction because it's really, really important. It's the most common form, as I said, and therefore most effort is taken in that direction. Now with dementia, what you have is basically, you will have your cognition or everyday function, so you're thinking, and here's your time and age. And with healthy aging, you should be okay. Maybe you're not as good as you were when you were younger, but what happens in dementia, of course, you have that you change this drastically at one point. So your functioning and your thinking is really impaired. And we want, of course, to diagnose this as early as possible. So we want to diagnose this as early as possible when this happens to potentially prevent people changing or treating them at that stage. Now, what do we do for diagnosis of dementia? Well, the most common thing, of course, is memory, and I've told you this already. What we call episodic memory, memory for specific events. And memory for specific events, I'll just give you an example because it's a very good example. Usually ask the patients is your wedding day. And your wedding day, you have a specific time and date. You have people who were at your wedding. You have a place. And sometimes you might even remember the presents. My wife would remember all the presents we got 12 years ago. I wouldn't remember anything of that. The interesting thing, of course, with memory and why it's so challenging is that it overlaps with loads of other events in your life. So you might have been to other weddings with similar time of the day, similar people, similar location. Maybe you gave the same present, or you went to baptism, or you had a party with the same people and similar presents. So all these are overlapping in your brain, which is really challenging. If you think about it, we never think about it, how challenging it actually is for us. Now, which brain region is really important for this memory? And the brain region most important for this is called the hippocampus, which is basically right in the middle of the brain. And it's called the hippocampus, which is nothing else than a Latin word for seahorse. Because if you take it out of the brain, it has a bit of a seahorse shape. And hence it is called the hippocampus. Oh, yeah, there you go. I'll put a seahorse there. You can see this region, again, this is a scan. So it's really right here, your eyeballs. This is my brain, by the way. So there you go. You can check whether my hippocampus seems intact or not. So these are my eyeballs. This is my brain. And here in the middle, you see really right in the middle, this region is the hippocampus in red. Here also shown, just from a different angle, basically. And what does the hippocampus do? Well, it basically links all this information together. It's a big indexing mechanism. So the hippocampus itself is not storing information. We don't think at the moment it's storing information, but it's an indexing mechanism. Like, for the older people here in the audience, and I remember this still very well, going to the library and you went through the library catalogs. Something like this. These days you would say it's Google or Siri or something like this. You can imagine Siri being your hippocampus. It has all indexed, all the information you can ask it for. And the important thing is the index can also then delineate or distinguish between all these different memories you might have for similar events which have sharing, overlapping information. Now, what happens in dementia and Alzheimer's disease in particular? Now, this is a bit complicated, this slide, but I hope I will make it clear. What you have here the hippocampus, again in red, and then you have around it what we would call the cortex. So these are the brain regions around it. And we think at the moment that in these cortical regions, this is where actually your memories are stored. But the hippocampus has the index for it. So it knows where is this information stored in the brain. And so if you learn something and information, the first part of this will usually happen in the hippocampus. So the information learning, or what we call encoding, is happening in the hippocampus. But over time, the more you retrieve this information, the information is actually stored in the cortex. And the hippocampus just has the location how to retrieve this, has the index for to retrieve the information. Now what happens in dementia is what you can see, this became, I hope you can see this, just do it again, the hippocampus here, I made this basically paler because the hippocampus, I've told you, is affected in dementia. And therefore, this part is affected. And what you have, therefore, it's much harder to create new memories because this is faulty. But the older memories, they stay pretty much intact, and the people seem to be living in the past. It's a really kind of explanation why people then suddenly start living and have really problems learning new information, can't really get this into their brain, but there's still the old information. And this is a common question. Well, why does she remember all these songs from her childhood? Well, it's exactly because of that. This information is so strongly stored, it will still be able to be retrieved. Now here comes the catch. So we use memory a lot for our assessment. If people can learn memory, and then we use this as a diagnosis. But the problem is that in healthy older people, so there's a healthy person, this is an Alzheimer's disease patient, you can see again the hippocampus here is really shrunk or shriveled in comparison to somebody the same age has what I would call quite a plump hippocampus. But this study, which was very kindly lent to me from the Cambridge Center for Aging and Neuroscience, did basically measure the hippocampus in people aged 20 to 90. And what it shows you, these are healthy people, that with healthy aging, your hippocampus shrinks anyway. Hence, our memories, unfortunately, get worse the older we're getting. And it's really because your brain is not as well functioning. But it creates a problem for us in the clinic to say, well, is this dementia or is this healthy aging? If somebody, do they just have a bad day remembering this information? Or are they really, do they have a dementia? The same for, this is a study from Harvard, which I like a lot, where they looked at age of peak performance for very different tests, for thinking tests. And basically, all down here are all the memory tests. And I'm afraid for most people here in the room, we're long past our peak. I'm long past the peak of my memory. And, you know, playing with my children memory, it's awful. I don't have to pretend to lose against them. I lose all the time. They are really much, much better. But what gets better is your vocabulary, of course. And hence, old people love their crosswords because you're very good with your vocabulary, obviously. So I always joke with my patients saying, well, you can still do your crosswords if you remember the words, obviously. So this is really the distinction between this. So it's a bit of a bizarre dichotomy that we use memory to measure, which we know now is long past the peak, and the brain structures affected might change as well with aging. So we did a lot of research, and I'm not going to present all these studies, but we thought about it, well, what would be another way of looking at this? And what we look at a lot now these days is spatial disorientation. This is the other symptom which I described to you. People getting lost, people getting disorientated. And I'm not showing it to you, but it's basically very similar brain regions in the brain. The hippocampus and another region in the brain are affected, are the main regions where we process our navigational abilities. I can't talk about how navigation really works. It would be another lecture. But how do we assess this in the clinic? And it's quite simple, actually, to do. So I can do the same with you now. And this is the audience participation time now. Everybody very excited, I can see that. So you walked into this building, of course. Now, can you point to me where you're sitting now? Where was the entrance to the building? Okay, so the people who got it wrong, you can see me later then, okay? Well, of course, most of you pointed backwards, correct. And this is exactly how our navigation system works. It consists of two mechanisms. One is a map-based system, where we have a location. It's like a GPS. I'm here on my map, which I have in the brain. But the other system is what I'm looking at. And you're looking at me, but at the same time, you know where the entrance was. So you can connect your viewpoint with your map representation. And we think this is a lot what gets faulty in dementia patients. This translation between where you look at and where you actually are in space gets really muddled up between them. And a patient only last week described to me this perfectly in the clinic, saying, it's as somebody took a piece out of a map in my brain. And I have to go to this Tesco to find a way to my friend's house, but I can't do it from my own house anymore, because that piece of the map is gone. It's exactly that. This information is lost, and therefore she can only find the way from Tesco to going to her friend. It's really this kind of relationship, and it's a very much more intuitive way than memory, we think, to assess this. So we designed, a PhD student of mine designed a task how we assess this in the clinic, and he designed a virtual reality supermarket. In this virtual reality supermarket, people just see on an iPad, the patients see just a quick clips where you always start at the beginning and then you do 3 turns. And then at the end, you get asked, well, in which direction was now where you started from? So they have to point in real life, and we just ask them to do that. And what we found is that this is very specific for Alzheimer's disease, while healthy people in other dementias, they're actually doing quite well on this. While Alzheimer's disease patients are terrible at this, so it's a very specific symptom to them. And it correlates very nicely with the brain regions. Again, I'm not talking about our brain imaging studies, but it's a very specific region with this. But this very simple task has been now taken up by 2 major international studies for the prevention and diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, which we're very excited about. And I wish we had designed it much more fancier, because you always start these projects, and now they're taken up and doing by thousands of patients basically worldwide. It's a very simple test though, and as I said to you, in the clinic we can just ask the people to translate this as well, point to where you came from, where was the entrance to the hospital, or where were the elevators. And that's really a way which we think is much more intuitively, it's much more what we call non-verbal, so you don't need to memorize word lists or anything like this, and it's also not so much dependent on education. So I have a student at the moment at UEA, and we got money from the British Council, and we're doing work with people in India where they have a lot of illiterate and low education patients which are very difficult to diagnose. We want to look at navigation, because navigation is what we do every day. Everybody does this. You don't need to have any information. So these illiterate patients, they can't even hold a pencil or pen because they never learned to write, but they can still do the navigation. So we're going to test this in these populations, which we think for them, they exist at the moment, no standardized way, which I think is very exciting. Now this is really great, but do we know how healthy people actually navigate? And this is a big question actually. It's not trivial, because when we started this is what everybody asked us. Well, there's so many urban myths out there. Men and women navigate differently. Every couple ever having shared a car journey can tell you a story before GPS arrived. And we don't know really how it also changes with aging. So we came up with the idea of developing actually a mobile game called Sea Hero Quest, which we developed in collaboration with colleagues at UCL, Alzheimer's Research UK, and our industry partner Deutsche Telekom, and a games company. And it's for free available. You can download it now. You can play it if you don't want to listen to me anymore. I'm very happy for you to play it, because you're contributing to science at the same time. And this game is really a casual game. It's meant to be very casual, in a way nearly silly. But underneath it, the science, we did very meticulously designed it. And it's had several implications that we can measure on a huge population level, navigation data, how people navigate, and at the same time get the young generation, inform them at the same time about dementia, how it is actually to get lost, because we make this more and more challenging, and they really can learn more information about dementia during the game. So it's also a public engagement campaign, which is fantastic. So in the game, this is just a screenshot from the game. As I said, it's very silly, but what you don't know, we designed every landmark you see, we've designed this. And for example, we have one level where you have to navigate and then you have to shoot back a flare to the buoy where you came from. This is nothing else than the supermarket task or what I just asked you to do. It's really just the same information what you're going to do. In others, you have to memorize a map and have to find then these different buoys, and you have to find them. As I said, behind it, if you see a top-down view of one of the maps, we actually designed it that we know where patients or where people should get more lost or less lost, because depending on where we put landmarks. So it was meticulously designed in the background. And the amazing thing is we can measure every player's position and heading direction every 500 milliseconds in the game. So this means we can trace actually where everybody went. Now, when we started this, the funders asked us, well, so what do you expect in terms of people? How many people will you get to play this game? And we said, well, let's go crazy. Let's say 100,000 people we're going to create it. And usually these studies, the biggest navigation study before had around 600 people. It was a huge effort. And they said, well, never. You're going to get never 100,000 people. Well, basically we made 100,000 people in the first 2 days. And we have by now around 2.8 million people who have played this, so, which is unbelievable across 193 countries. If you believe it or not, apparently even 22 people in North Korea played it. And we have a very nice age range. Now, obviously, for these games, more people will be younger, but we get a very nice distribution. So we have hundreds of thousands of people as well over 65, which is very important for us, obviously, for our research. And it's really over 75 years of playtime, and it would have taken us over 10,000 years to get the same amount of people through our lab, actually. It's just unbelievable to think about it. Just putting it out there as a kind of using new technology to getting people engaged. They have fun, because the game was meant to be fun, and at the same time contribute to science. Now the problem is we're currently analyzing the data. We have a postdoc working on this, so I can only give you a very quick glimpse on some things we're doing. And this, for example, one level. This is just for 200,000 people, how they basically navigated in this level, where they had to find this boy, then this, and then this. And what you can see, you can directly trace how people actually move and who gets lost, for example, in this appendix here, and who finds the boy, and who goes which way around. Do they go from here? Do they go back down, or do they go up over the top and then back? And that really gives us information a lot, and we know we can look at different ages, genders, how people, where they come from. But the exciting thing for the clinical purposes is that we can also overlay this then with how single people navigate in comparison to the population. And with that, you get a much more personalized diagnosis then for people. So if you navigate or if you deviate, we can do then, because we have such a large sample set, we can look at women age 68 in the UK. We can put the normative data and then compare you to that. So we personalize the diagnosis. We think it's a really exciting new venture, actually, to do this. And potentially, we think we can move the goalpost of the diagnosis much earlier, because what we've seen is that navigation might be much earlier affected already in dementia before memory, actually, which is very exciting. Now, treatment management is quite quick, because pharmacological treatments, these are the approved drugs for dementia. And you can see there's loads of zeros here. These 5 down here are pretty much only drugs which basically treat symptoms but don't treat the disease. So it's awful at the moment. We really don't have anything we can really offer the patients except for treating their symptoms. And reasons for this is that it takes 12.5 years on average from a drug to be developed, actually. The whole process takes 12.5 years. It's an awful long time. And it takes roughly £1 billion to develop one new drug. Unbelievable numbers, if you think about it. And therefore, drug companies are very reluctant to take this on. But again, in comparison to cancer, around 290 ongoing clinical trials in dementia in the EU, while in cancer, there are over 4,000. So we're lacking, far behind. We need to do much, much more and work much, much more in this direction. The current drugs which are available, so these are what we call cholinesterase inhibitors. This shows you patients, these are 2,500 patients, and it shows you their basically decline in thinking, and then the drug is given, and you see this bump, and then the continuation. So the current drugs we're giving the patients maybe 8 to 9 month time, where it stabilizes, and then the disease continues, which is not good enough, obviously. But they are exciting. So this is last year only came this out. This is a new drug which really seems to remove one of the proteins. So these are people who are treated with a drug, and you can see the colors. This is the proteins in the brain are really reduced. And we're very excited about this. This is a new drug which hopefully will come out in the future. So how about the UEA? Well, at UEA I have a fantastic nutrition and diet actually research happening, particularly because we have the Institute of Food Research and the John Innes Center. We have fantastic facilities there. So we do a lot of work with this now, and in particular omega-3, which is by Professor Anne-Marie Minahan headed. And this is not just crazy to think about food as this, because omega-3 has really strong neurogenesis factors in the hippocampus. So the growth of new cells in the hippocampus is really triggered by these foods which are high on omega-3. So eating your oily fish really improves your memory. It's really true. So eat your oily fish, your memory will be better. The same we do with flavonoids. So this is another group of foods which is particularly head by Professor Aidan Cassidy, which we collaborate with. And these foods, they are very good anti-inflammatory. So a lot of problems, what happens in dementia, the cells get basically these proteins accumulate, and what happens is a huge inflammatory response. So if we can reduce the inflammation or create new neurogenesis, we can potentially impact on this. Now, nobody's talking about curing dementia like this, but what we can do is we can change the disease trajectory and make it maybe milder. And that's really important. Now, coming to prevention, really, and first of all, I talk here about the risk factors of dementia. Well, this is the bad news for us all. So age is the biggest risk factor for dementia, and I'm afraid we can't change our age, or not yet at least, who knows. Elon Musk must be working on something along that lines as well, I guess. Now, 3/4 of people are unaware that they actually can affect their risk of developing dementia. And this is an important piece of news, that you can do something about it. So this is very often a comment I get from more cynical people, I guess, who say, well, that's great, you can diagnose it earlier, but you still can't do anything about it. But if we can diagnose it earlier and we can modify the risk, you can actually change something. You can potentially delay something. Around a third of a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease may be due to modifiable factors, lifestyle factors. That's quite a significant number of people who can do this. And lifestyle changes, in particular to improve cardiovascular health, can reduce the risk of dementia. Now, I've told you already, of course, vascular dementia is a lot of related to this. And vascular and Alzheimer's dementia very often co-occur, especially in older patients. So we have the usual suspects, which we all know about, of course. We know smoking, hypertension, bad food, and your weight, and in particular with this diabetes type 2, is bad for you and will not only give you cardiovascular disease and potentially cancer, it also increases your risk of dementia. So it's a full house. It's really just bad for you. So we really have currently the message really for public health is what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And that's really a message we're trying to re-emphasize over and over again. And it's really a message people already are familiar with this. So what would you do? Well, let's talk about physical exercise. Well, you can do 30 minutes of moderate intensity activity, like cycling, even your hoovering is considered moderate activity, gardening, taking your dog for a walk, or you can do the real, go for it basically, high intensity activity for 15 minutes, real competitive cycling. I don't know if you want to play rugby if you're older, but yeah, you could if you wanted to. So you can do loads of things. It's not only about doing high intensity, you can do that, but even going out for walks, or there's a common trend now at the moment for more strength exercises, even while sitting. So people who can't walk anymore because they have hip problems potentially, you can do a lot of exercise. And of course, they just came out, and this was just on Radio 4 the other day as well, these books like Stop Sitting and Get Moving, which are exercise books for people over 60, and really are written for this, to get you going and give you exercises which don't necessarily need that you go running the London Marathon last Sunday, basically. You don't need to do that. It's more important that you keep active physically. Now, food and drink. Well, again, this is public health. You all know this. We all know this, obviously. The problem is, when somebody tells you something to do, of course, nobody of us wants to listen, you know. And we always have our good intentions at the beginning of the year, and then our habits kick in. So we at UEA, we have also a very strong health psychology department where we're investigating what is the best way of convincing people really to change their lifestyle and then improve their life. Because everybody knows the risks. We all know that. We all know we should eat healthy, but it's hard, of course, you know. The final thing is really mental exercise, and this is something we shouldn't really underestimate, and we do a lot of work on this because we see a lot, in particular when patients get first diagnosed, there is a lot of stigma around dementia still, and people usually socially more withdraw. And that's a big problem because social engagement is very important for keeping grips basically, that you're engaged with other people. So keep on using your crosswords and your Sudokus. We always tell the patients that's great, and we say this also to healthy people. Keep active in your brain. But the thing is, if you've done all your life Sudoku, it's nice for you, but even better, learn something new. Learning something new, and that's much harder at older age, it's the best way of really getting active with that. And with that, of course, for example, changing something, learn an instrument, join a choir. If you never sang in a choir, you can't do that. It gives you then the social engagement and a new activity. So you have to learn something new, very challenging, but it will really get you going in your brain. And finally, as I said, socially, play bridge, go or combine things. Playing bridge keeps, of course, your mind is very good for your memory. You have a social ring, or you go golfing, of course, if you don't drink too many pints afterwards in the clubhouse, obviously. But you get out, you exercise, you walk all these across the golf club, and you engage with people. So ongoing UEA studies, we're looking a lot into this. We have several studies ongoing with this, omega-3 flavonoids and also exercise, where we're combining this. And UEA Sports Park actually has a fantastic program now for elderly as well to keep them engaged, offer them opportunities for this. So it's a really great way of connecting with all this. And we're very excited by this new development. So this is going up at the moment at the site of the Norwich, the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, just beside the building where I'm now. It's called the Quadram Institute, which is an £80 million investment by several partners, including UEA, the hospital, and the BBSRC, which is all about science, health, and food. So a lot of this will be on healthy aging, where we're going to actually look at how healthy aging and food will impact on you. And we're working a lot with people alongside this, which is, I think, very, very exciting, because food is still... it's what we eat every day, so it can be an easy medication in a way, and very cheap medication for us to use, of course, if it's effective. Now, I've talked about that. I'm not telling you that food and diet will cure dementia or treat dementia. This will be very likely something pharmacological. But even delaying the onset has huge implications. So if the onset of dementia could be delayed by 2 years, the savings would be nearly £13 billion a year. So huge savings. And if it was delayed by 5 years, it could be £21 billion per year. So you're saving enormous amounts of money, even just delaying the onset. Similarly, if you actually slowing the progression of the disease by 25%, you can save on treatment this amount and this amount per year. So huge numbers again for the UK economy, which I think are really important to take into account. So not only curing it, but also slowing or delaying the onset is really important. And we can all do our bit, as I said, by staying healthy. Take-home messages. Dementia numbers are high and will double over the next 30 years. So we will see an increasing number of dementia. There are currently no effective treatments for dementia. We're only treating symptoms. Earlier, more specific diagnosis is needed. And as I told you, it's important because we can potentially delay the onset or slow the progression by our interventions. Research into prevention, diagnosis, and treatment is critical if we want to manage this upcoming challenge for our society. And just a final thing, this is a group at UEA, and this is again the UEA Dementia Research Collaborative. My email address, feel free to write me, really. I'm very happy to take emails, and thank you, vielen Dank. Right, I went a bit over, but there you go. Do we have any questions? Very happy to take questions. Yes, please. If you wait for the microphone, that would be great so everybody can hear it.
Right at the beginning, when you showed the graphs that showed women much more badly affected than men, even if I assume there were more older women than older men, and I don't know if that's still true, why is that so?
Yeah, the first
Do we know?
Yes,
Why?
yeah. It's a very good question. You already partly answered it yourself, that, of course, women get older usually than men, still in our society. And because age is your biggest risk factor, you will have more female patients with dementia, because the man very often will have died of cardiovascular diseases very often before. However, even for people at the younger age, we see more women. We don't know yet why that is. We assume at the moment there are some theories around this, that this might be to do with cholesterol processing in the brain, which of course, again, is your vascular health. Why that is, we don't know. Any, yep, down here.
Hi, hello. Very informative talk. Really appreciated it. It was intriguing when you talked about the app that had been developed, and clearly there's a big effort to collect all that data, but I think more of a challenge is how to make sense of the data you have there. I mean, clearly there are some things you can pick out, but this is a case you're collecting some real-world data, some observational data with a very broad population of data. So you've got age range, you've got people different uses, even maybe people feeling very tired, or maybe they've had a few drinks or something. It may affect how they perform in this as well. So how would you make sense of that, given that there are certain limitations in this, great as it is in terms of collecting data?
Yes, no, absolutely, you're absolutely right. This is the thing, if you do real life, if you take data collection out of the lab, you need to make sure that it's reliable what you're collecting. The good thing is the number of people allows you to look at this, because people who deviate from the norm and are supposedly healthy, we can actually take them out. And we also put a lot of fail-safe mechanisms in this. So for example, in the first 2 levels, we're actually not collecting any data. We're actually only looking how people are interacting with the device. This mainly for 2 reasons. One is, of course, older people will be usually much slower than somebody who is 19 and whizzing through the game. And we want to control for this, that somebody who's old can still navigate very well, but might take longer. At the same time, is this just somebody randomly, pointing on the iPad? Is the dog just chewing on the iPad? Which can be, if you put it out there, you don't know what people are doing. So we try to put as many fail-safe mechanisms in there, and as much demographics in the background. But of course, it is a limitation. But because you get such a large sample set, you can then validate it in smaller cohorts in the lab, and that's exactly what we're doing now, where it's much more controlled. Yep, loads. Let's go there in the middle then, yeah.
You mentioned the social withdrawal among patients, and one of the questions I had is the way we care for people with dementia. Is there anything that we're not doing that could affect the costs, but also the welfare and the outcome of patients?
Yes, the major point of this is to keep people as long as possible at home. The data is, I say that, if you want to stay healthy, stay out of the hospital. It's the old saying my grandmother always told me, and it's still true. And for dementia patients who come into hospital, their outcome is much, much worse in general, and their quality of life is much, much worse. You can see general deterioration. So the longer they can stay at home, usually the better. But the other, of course, side of the medal for this is that it's a huge challenge for the families, because patients get more and more impaired. To manage that at home can be very, very difficult. So there comes a stage in the disease where you have to say, okay, maybe we should discuss a care home setting. But if you can, stay out of the hospital, basically. That's the best way that you can avoid people having the best quality of life over the disease, and usually they're staying much longer healthy within the disease. Oh, sorry, we're going up now.
It's okay. I was very struck by excuse my throat, I was very struck by the comparisons of both the fundraising and research with the other major. If we look internationally, are there other countries who are really doing a good job in this field?
No, it's pretty much globally, it's the same picture. I think the country may be leading in terms of dementia research, maybe 2 countries. One is Japan, of course, because they had a much older population, so they went through the whole thing basically 20 years ago, and they put the services in place when we could learn a lot from Japan in that direction. And in Europe, I think it's the Netherlands who've really, they put themselves a lot of money, the government, in this, and they created dementia villages, and they've put a lot of resources in. Thankfully, it's changing now here, but globally, in general, cancer still beats everybody. I think we had down here, sorry, we can. Yeah.
Could you comment on, about diagnosis? The balance that clinicians like you presumably have to make between what comes up on the brain scans and what people are capable of analysing cognitively.
Yes. Well, the diagnosis is a very difficult one. As I said, you have to first check if somebody is not just having a bad day. And of course, with older people, you always need to also check if there's some signs of depression. So age-related depression is very, very common actually, and people don't know this. And depression impacts a lot on your memory. You have much poorer memory if you're slightly depressed. So this is the first things we're checking on. Are you feeling a bit down? Are you feeling a bit blue? We're checking for this. And then if you're still not so sure, you actually re-invite people 6 months later to double check if that's the same. But that means, of course, the diagnosis is instantly delayed by 6 months. And you could have treated, of course, in that time or changed something. But you don't want to give people, of course, a diagnosis of dementia, and 6 months later, they're actually fine. And a lot of, up to 30% of patients who present at the clinic and complain of their memory, after a year, they're back to normal, basically. So it's a huge challenge for us, and therefore we're quite reluctant to give a diagnosis out, which in a way is a vicious cycle, obviously. Very good question, yeah. More questions? Maybe we go to the back again.
Good evening. I'm the daughter of, my father passed away last year from vascular dementia. My mother has been in a care home with Alzheimer's for 4 years. How long do you think it will take before the research and the advancement in dementia catches up with everything we've done on heart disease, cancer? Because it seems to be we've got an enormous gap and a long way to go.
Yes, I'm afraid it's a very difficult question to answer, obviously. I can't give you a date, but all I can tell you is that the government has really woken up to this and has really changed. Funding-wise, there is much more funding now coming into dementia research, and we're very happy about this. And there's, so, for example, a new UK Dementia Research Institute, which just launched, which is really will be spearheading the whole research in that direction. So there is a lot happening. There is millions of pounds are flowing now into this because the government realized it needs to do something. In terms of when do we have a treatment? Well, as I said, this aducanumab, which I showed this trial, is now in phase 3, in clinical trial phase 3, which means if it becomes licensed as a drug, it will be, if it's successful, first of all, in this trial, if it's licensed as a drug, it will be still very likely 5 to 6 years until it's licensed. And it takes an awful lot of time to get new medication licensed these days. So as well, from people like you, we need to have the engagement of carers and former carers to really be spokespersons for this. That happened with HIV, where the spokespeople were really challenging the whole process, and HIV drugs were much quicker than with shortcut, basically, for development and for licensing. Maybe we need something like this for dementia. We are biased, of course. If I say this, they will say, well, yes, of course, you want that earlier. But if people, dementia carers and dementia patients themselves are spokespeople, that would be important. Yeah, thank you. Another one there in the back, if we can just go on. Yep.
Excellent talk, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking about our youngsters and if there's any work being done about children and how long they're spending on computers with these gaming. If there's any work being done around if that's going to affect their potential for getting dementia, or is that going to support their, effects of not getting it in the future?
Yes. So in terms of environmental factors, there is really no good evidence that this will affect you if you develop this. So let them play their computers as long as it doesn't affect their education, I would say, because education is much more important, we think, as a factor for having a healthy brain, being mentally active. But whether the youngsters, what they do now, I would be more worried, instead of gaming, I would be more worried about illicit drugs with teenagers, I think, than anything else. But there is no evidence, basically, at the moment that this will impact whether they will develop dementia or not. Yeah. Let's go down here again. We had one here. Yes, he was waiting a long time. If we can just, yeah.
Have there been any global studies done to establish any broader correlations? For example, groupings by geography, by racial background, by level of hygiene, the hygiene of the general environment, any broader factors like that?
Yes, so very good question. So there have been now, these studies are ongoing, and there have been already a few. So pollution is one big one, air pollution, which really impacts on this, and we think this might be the inflammation, basically inflammatory response of the brain, which might impact on you. So if you live in a very air-polluted area, it might increase your chances, actually, of developing dementia. In terms of global distribution, the biggest increases are meant to be seen in Asia, because in Asia you have usually higher risks of diabetes and cardiovascular changes, because the lifestyle changes have not come through. So the projections from the WHO are the highest in those regions at the moment, which is not really recognized at the moment in here. So it's very much Euro-US focused, as most research is. So the emphasis is on this. And of course, we're quite healthy now already for our cardiovascular. We all have our, trackers and whatever you have, basically, counting your steps all the time, which is great. But yeah, so distribution-wise, that will be a big impact. Yeah, okay, two more. Let's have the lady over there.
What is the correlation between depression and memory function?
So yeah, there is a very strong correlation. So if you're depressed, your memory will be much worse, basically, because of the brain structures involved. So the depression affects a region which sits right in front of the hippocampus, called the amygdala, and very much impacts on the hippocampus. So therefore, any encoding of information is dampened down by the depression. That's all we know at the moment. The exact mechanism is not really completely understood at the moment. But depression and general mental health can really impact your brain quite significantly. Yeah. Final one, let's go to the balustrade. There's somebody just there. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. I was interested in the relationship between social factors and dementia. So aside from pharmacological interventions, is there any evidence that increasing opportunities for contact or opportunities for groups can slow the progression of symptoms?
Yes, great question, because as you know now, pharmacology at the moment doesn't work. So we need to look at other mechanisms, which we do a lot. So we're investigating at the moment, we're having an ongoing study across the whole of the dementia cafes in Norfolk. If actually people attending this, does this change how they actually patients and their carers cope and the disease progression? It's one thing. The other thing, of course, in terms of, there's a lot of research now for more moderate dementia or severe dementia in terms of music therapy, that music can really still connect to people quite even at the very severe stages and can really make them, in a way, bloom. They become alive again, which is lovely. And this is much more work we need to do, and can very often create, again, a bond between the family and the patient, which very often at the end is very difficult for them, of course. So very often the families tell us, the patient has died twice. Once when we lost the personality, and then once they really passed away. So it's a long grieving process as well for the family, which is very, very challenging, of course. So non-pharmacological interventions, yes, we need them, and doing work in this via speech and language therapy, OTs, nurses, is fantastic. Thank you.
I'd just like to close by a formal vote of thanks to Michael for his excellent lecture this evening. I've certainly learnt a lot more about dementia than I knew before, and I think he's excellently made quite a complex topic very easy for us to understand as lay people. So really huge thanks for taking your subject and explaining it so beautifully to us. And it's very clear to me as well that there's so much that we need to do here. So I hope I will certainly be going out and lobbying for more research in this area. And I feel comforted that Michael and his team are working on this, as well as other people around the world on this challenging area of research, but clearly one we need to do a lot more work on. So if you'll join me in thanking.
Thank you.